You really think you belong in this line, Mom? Jason Collins said with a half-smirk that cut deeper than the airport noise around us. I stood in the standard boarding queue at Dayton International Airport in Ohio, holding my worn Navy travel bag close to my side, feeling the steady shuffle of shoes and rolling suitcases around me. It should have been a simple flight to Chicago, a quiet visit to see family friends, nothing more. But the way Jason looked at me, as if I had misplaced myself in the world, told me this moment was about more than travel. They'll call us up soon, I said calmly, keeping my eyes forward, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be waiting for. Jason let out a small laugh, loud enough for the people behind us to hear. Us? Mom, there is no us in priority boarding. You're just slowing everything down. A few heads turned. I felt the heat of attention rise across my cheeks, but I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only feeds people who enjoy control. Instead, I adjusted my grip on the strap of my bag and stayed silent. Jason wasn't done. He glanced around the line, then back at me, lowering his voice just enough to sound like he was sharing something obvious with strangers. She insists on traveling like she used to run things. It's honestly kind of impressive, in a sad way. A couple nearby gave uncomfortable smiles, unsure whether to agree or look away. I could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing in, but I kept my posture steady, my expression neutral. Inside, however, something was tightening. Not anger exactly, but a familiar recognition of being reduced too quickly by someone who once called me every day for advice. Jason checked his watch dramatically. Mom, if you're confused, I can move you to the regular line. It's okay. Not everyone understands how airports work these days. The word everyone lingered in the air like an accusation. I finally turned my head slightly toward him. I understand just fine, I said quietly. My voice didn't rise, didn't shake. That seemed to frustrate him more than silence. He leaned in closer, lowering his tone now, but not his intent. Then act like it. People are watching. And they were. I could feel it in the stillness of the line, in the way a child behind us stopped fidgeting, in the way a woman 2 spots ahead pretended to check her phone but didn't swipe. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment pass through me instead of into me. Jason, I said after a pause, my voice even, almost gentle, you don't need to explain airports to me. That was all I said. No defense, no correction, just a fact, left hanging between us. He gave a short laugh again, but it didn't carry the same confidence. For a brief second, his eyes shifted past me toward the checkpoint ahead, where an airport security officer stood observing the flow of passengers. The officer's gaze lingered a moment longer than usual before moving on, as if noting something he wasn't yet ready to act on. Jason didn't notice that part. He was too busy trying to reclaim the room with his voice, while I simply stood still, waiting for what would come next. I remained still in the moving current of the airport, listening to the layered sounds of announcements, rolling luggage, and distant footsteps echoing through the high ceilings of Dayton International Airport. Jason stayed beside me, but not with me, his presence more like a shadow that kept shifting between impatience and pride in his own voice. He kept glancing at the boarding screens as if he was counting down something far more important than a flight. You know, Mom, he said after a moment, lowering his voice just enough to sound almost reasonable. It is not about you not knowing things. It is about knowing when things have changed. I did not respond. Instead, I looked past him at the steady movement of travelers, each one absorbed in their own direction, their own purpose. There was a time when I used to believe that purpose was something you carried with quiet certainty, not something you had to announce to others. Jason shifted his weight and exhaled sharply. You used to handle things differently, he added, almost like he was talking to himself now. I remember when you were organized. When you had control. The word control lingered longer than the rest. I felt it land softly in my chest. Not as pain, but as distance. I nodded slightly, not to agree, but to acknowledge that he was speaking from a version of me that no longer existed in his mind. What Jason did not know was that silence had become my language long before he learned to form his opinions about me. I adjusted the strap of my bag again, feeling the familiar texture of worn fabric under my fingers, and let my eyes drift toward the security checkpoint. A uniformed officer stood there, observing the flow of passengers with a calm attention that most people would never notice unless they had spent years noticing everything. Something about the way he paused occasionally, scanning faces without expression, felt less like routine and more like recognition waiting to happen. Jason followed my gaze and chuckled lightly. "Do not tell me you are nervous about security. It is just a standard line, Mom." I finally spoke again, softly. "I am not nervous." He tilted his head, studying me like I had answered incorrectly. "Then what is it?" I hesitated, not because I lacked an answer, but because the truth was never simple enough for the way he asked questions. "I am remembering," I said. Jason frowned. "Remembering what?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, fragments of another time began to surface, not sharply, but like reflections on water that refused to stay still. Offices with long corridors. Conversations that ended with signatures instead of conclusions. Systems that required precision, not recognition. People who never raised their voices because they did not need to. Jason laughed under his breath. "Mom, you are thinking too deeply about an airport line." But I was no longer focused on the line. I was thinking about how easily people confuse absence of display with absence of capability. The boarding area shifted slightly as the crowd adjusted, and I noticed the security officer glance again in our direction, this time longer. Not at Jason, but at me. His expression did not change, but something in his posture subtly aligned, as if a detail had been placed correctly in a pattern he already understood. Jason noticed nothing. He was still caught in his own commentary, still shaping me into a version of inconvenience that made sense to him. "When we get on board," he said, checking his watch again, "you should just relax. I will handle everything from here." I looked at him then, not with challenge, but with quiet clarity. "Jason," I said gently, "you have been handling things from here for a long time already." He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it, as if unsure whether that was meant as agreement or correction. For the first time since we arrived, he did not immediately respond. The airport speaker announced a boarding group, and the line ahead of us shifted forward in a slow, organized motion. I stepped with it, not because I was following, but because I had always known when to move without needing permission. Behind us, Jason followed, still speaking, still unaware that something in the environment around us had begun to change in ways he could not yet name. I continued walking forward with the slow movement of the boarding line, feeling the subtle shift in atmosphere that Jason still seemed completely unaware of. The corridor leading toward the gate was brighter here, the overhead lights reflecting off polished floors, and the sound of rolling suitcases echoed in a more controlled rhythm. Jason stayed close behind me now, but his confidence had begun to return, as if the earlier silence had been an inconvenience he had already mentally corrected. "See," he said lightly, gesturing ahead toward the boarding gate. "This is how it is supposed to go. Everything organized. No confusion." I did not answer. My attention had shifted toward the security checkpoint position just before the final boarding scan. The officer there, the same one I had noticed earlier, stood slightly apart from the rest, watching not just the line but the individuals within it. His posture was steady, professional, but there was a kind of deliberate patience in the way he observed. When our turn inched closer, I felt it again, that quiet sense of recognition that did not belong to the present moment alone. Jason leaned slightly toward me and whispered, though not quietly enough, "After we board, I will make sure you are comfortable. I know you do not travel like this often anymore." The phrasing was casual, but the implication was not. I could feel a few passengers nearby glance in our direction again, registering the tone rather than the words. I kept my expression neutral. When we reached the checkpoint, Jason placed his boarding pass and identification on the scanner tray first, sliding them forward with practiced ease. Then he stepped aside slightly, expecting me to follow the same routine without interruption. I placed my documents down after him. The officer scanned Jason's information quickly, nodding without hesitation, then shifted his attention toward me. The moment his eyes met the name on my identification, there was the smallest pause. Not dramatic, not obvious to anyone not paying attention, but precise enough that I noticed immediately. His gaze moved from the document back to me, then returned once more to the screen in front of him. Jason noticed nothing. He was already adjusting his jacket, glancing toward the boarding tunnel, as if preparing for the next stage of his own narrative. The officer did not speak at first. Instead, He took a slow breath and pressed a key on his terminal. A soft confirmation tone followed. Another pause. Then he looked up fully at me. "One moment, please," he said calmly. Jason turned back immediately. "Is there a problem?" he asked, already sounding slightly irritated, as if any delay was a personal inconvenience directed at him. The officer did not answer him directly. Instead, he gestured politely toward a small area just beside the checkpoint. "Ma'am, could you step this way for a brief verification?" I nodded once and stepped forward without resistance. Jason followed instantly, his tone sharpening. "Verification for what exactly?" he asked. The officer maintained his calm expression. "Standard procedure," he replied. But his eyes remained on me, not Jason. That detail settled into the air differently than anything Jason had said so far. I could feel the shift now, subtle but undeniable, like the environment itself had recalibrated around a piece of information only a few people were aware of. Jason lowered his voice as we moved aside. "Mom, what is this? Did you do something with your booking?" I looked at him briefly. "No," I said simply. That was all. No explanation, no defense. The officer stepped slightly closer to his station, speaking into a small microphone, his tone controlled and respectful. "We just need a moment to confirm access clearance." Jason frowned. "Access clearance?" he repeated, now clearly unsettled. I stood still while the officer typed a few entries into his system. The sound of the keyboard clicks filled the short silence between us. Around us, passengers continued moving forward, unaware that anything unusual was happening. Yet I could feel the atmosphere narrowing, focusing, like attention had been quietly drawn into a smaller and more precise space. Jason looked at me again, this time without the earlier amusement. "Mom," he said more quietly now, "what is going on?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the officer's expression change in the smallest possible way, not surprise, but recognition aligning with confirmation. He straightened slightly, then spoke with a different tone than before, still professional, but now distinctly formal. "Thank you for your patience, Mrs. Collins," he said. Jason froze for the first time, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were delivered. I remained still, waiting, as the system finished whatever it needed to confirm, while Jason stood beside me, trying to understand something that had already begun moving beyond his control. I stood still beside the security checkpoint as the officer's words settled into the space between us, the formality in his voice changing the entire shape of the moment. Jason shifted immediately, his confusion turning sharper, more impatient. "Mrs. Collins," he repeated under his breath, as if testing whether the name alone could explain anything. I did not move. The officer glanced at his screen again, then back at me, and for the first time, there was a quiet respect in his expression that did not belong to routine procedure. "Thank you for your patience," he said again, slightly more deliberate this time. "There is a brief confirmation required, but everything appears in order." Jason let out a short laugh, but it lacked conviction. "In order for what?" "She is just flying to Chicago." The officer did not respond to Jason. Instead, he made a small adjustment on his terminal, then stepped slightly aside, as if making room for something that had already been decided above his level. I noticed it then, the subtle shift in how other staff nearby began to look in our direction. Not openly, not dramatically, but with the kind of awareness that comes when someone's presence is quietly flagged within a system that most passengers never think about. Jason leaned closer to me, lowering his voice, but his frustration was rising. "Mom, what did you do? Did you upgrade something without telling me?" I turned my head slightly toward him. "I did not do anything," I said calmly. That was the truth, and I did not feel the need to expand on it. The officer stepped forward again, this time with a different tone entirely, one that carried a formality that was no longer procedural but personal in its precision. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "we have completed verification. You are cleared for immediate boarding through priority access." The words landed differently than anything Jason had been expecting. His expression shifted instantly, confusion tightening into disbelief. "Priority access?" he repeated. "That does not make sense. She is not part of any priority program." The officer finally looked at him directly, but his answer was still not addressed to Jason. "Her status is already registered and active," he said evenly. Jason froze for a fraction of a second, then turned back to me, studying my face as if searching for an explanation that had suddenly become necessary. "What status?" he asked, his voice lower now. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the officer step slightly to the side, gesturing toward the boarding gate ahead. The corridor beyond it looked unchanged, ordinary, filled with passengers continuing their journeys without interruption, yet the space around me felt subtly realigned, as if I had been placed back into a category that had been temporarily forgotten. Jason's voice sharpened again, though it was quieter now, controlled in a way that did not fully hide his discomfort. "Mom, this is not normal. People do not just get called like this at a checkpoint." The officer finally spoke again, this time with careful clarity. "Ma'am, you may proceed whenever you are ready." There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty, just confirmation. I nodded once. Jason stepped slightly forward as if to follow, but the officer gently raised a hand. "Sir, you will proceed through standard boarding when your group is called." Jason stopped mid-step. "But she is with me," he said immediately. The officer's response was simple, almost quiet. "Not in this segment." The words did not carry emotion, but they created separation instantly. Jason turned toward me, and for the first time since we arrived at the airport, his confidence faltered completely. "Mom," he said, "what is happening?" I looked at him then, not with explanation, not with defense, but with the same calm I had carried since the beginning of the line. "Nothing new is happening," I said softly. "You are just noticing it now." And with that, I took a small step forward toward the gate where the officer stood waiting, while Jason remained behind in the shifting silence of a moment he no longer controlled. I stepped forward through the checkpoint area as the officer guided me with a quiet gesture, and for the first time since arriving at the airport, the space around me felt different in a way I could not fully explain in words. It was not louder or brighter, but more attentive, as if the environment itself had adjusted its focus. Behind me, I could hear Jason's footsteps hesitate, then follow again, uncertain and uneven. The officer walked slightly ahead of me now, leading rather than processing, and that subtle change carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. Jason's voice broke the silence from behind. "This is ridiculous. Mom, just tell me what is going on right now." I did not turn around. The officer did. "Sir," he said calmly, "you will need to wait for your designated boarding group." Jason let out a short, frustrated breath. "She is my mother. We are traveling together." The officer paused, then responded with a level tone that did not invite argument. "Your boarding status and her clearance are processed separately." That sentence hung in the air in a way that made Jason go quiet for half a second before he tried to regain control. "That does not make any sense," he said again, louder this time, drawing a few nearby glances. I continued walking forward, following the officer toward a side corridor that led away from the standard boarding queue. The movement was subtle, but unmistakably intentional. We were no longer part of the same flow of passengers. Jason followed a few steps behind, his presence now less confident, more uncertain. "Mom," he called again, "stop walking and talk to me." The officer raised a hand slightly without stopping. "Sir, please remain in the standard boarding area." Jason stopped. For the first time, he was physically separated from me by instruction rather than distance. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see him standing under the airport lights, surrounded by people who were still moving forward while he was not. His expression had changed completely now, no longer amused or dismissive, but unsettled. "This is not normal," he said again, but his voice was lower now, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. The officer guided me to a quieter section near a secured door marked with restricted access signage. He scanned something again on a handheld device, then nodded once, as if confirming what he already knew. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "you may proceed to the designated boarding lounge. Someone will meet you there." I looked at him for a moment. "And my flight?" I asked simply. "Your flight is confirmed," he replied. "Your boarding path has been adjusted for priority handling." There was no drama in his tone, only certainty. I nodded once and continued forward. The door opened automatically, revealing a calmer, quieter space beyond the main terminal. It was not crowded, not rushed, and the noise of the airport behind me faded almost immediately. Jason's voice called out one last time from behind the barrier. "Mom, this is not over. You cannot just walk away from me like this." I stopped for a brief moment, not turning back fully, only slightly. I am not walking away from you, I said gently. I am just continuing my journey. Then I stepped through. The door closed softly behind me, and the sound of the terminal outside became distant, muffled, almost like it belonged to a different part of the day. Ahead, the officer from earlier was no longer beside me, but another staff member stood waiting near the entrance to the lounge area, offering a polite nod of acknowledgement. I walked forward without hesitation, feeling something settle inside me that had nothing to do with airports, boarding lines, or explanations. Behind the glass and metal barriers, Jason remained where he was, still trying to understand a system that had already moved past his assumptions. I walked deeper into the quiet corridor beyond the boarding checkpoint, feeling the heavy contrast between the controlled silence of this space and the distant, restless noise of the terminal I had just left behind. The lounge entrance ahead was marked with simple signage, yet the atmosphere around it carried a level of calm that felt almost separate from the rest of the airport. A staff member stood waiting for me, offering a respectful nod without saying a word, then stepped aside to allow me through. As I entered, the lighting softened, and the sound of rolling luggage disappeared almost completely. It was not luxury that struck me first, but the absence of tension. Behind me, through the glass partition, I could still see Jason in the distance, standing near the checkpoint barrier. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in the way he stood still while everything around him continued moving forward. His eyes were fixed on me, but I could tell he was no longer certain what he was looking at. Inside the lounge, I was guided to a seating area near the window. The city skyline in the distance looked calm, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all outside of this moment. A staff member approached and placed a small folder on the table beside me. "Everything for your flight has been confirmed," she said politely. "You will board directly when ready." I nodded, but my attention drifted back to the window where Jason was still visible. Beyond the glass and distance, he had not moved much, except for the occasional shift in posture, like someone trying to regain control of a situation that no longer responded to him. Moments later, he pulled out his phone, speaking urgently, his expression tightening as he looked toward the gate area and then back in my direction. I could not hear his words, but I could see the frustration building in the way he paced slightly within his limited space. The officer who had escorted me earlier briefly appeared near the partition outside, speaking with another staff member, then glancing once in my direction before continuing on. There was no urgency in their movement, only coordination, as if everything had already been resolved at a level beyond what Jason was still trying to understand. I sat back slightly in my chair, hands resting still, observing without interruption. There was no need to explain anything, no need to correct anything. The situation was already unfolding without my involvement now. Jason's attention shifted again, this time toward the gate display, as if searching for an answer there instead of the people around him. I could see the moment of realization beginning to form, though it had not fully arrived. It was not dramatic, not sudden, but slow and uncomfortable, like something he had been avoiding finally refusing to stay hidden. A few minutes passed in silence inside the lounge. Then another staff member approached me, speaking softly. "Your boarding will begin shortly, Mrs. Collins. You will be escorted directly." I acknowledged with a slight nod. Outside the glass, Jason took a step forward, as if trying to approach the barrier, then stopped when he realized it would not change anything. His shoulders lowered slightly, and for the first time since the airport line, he did not speak. I looked out once more, not with satisfaction or emotion, but with clarity. The distance between us was no longer just physical. It had become something else entirely. Then I stood up, ready to continue forward, while the space behind me remained still in its silence. I stood from the seat in the quiet lounge as the staff member approached again, her presence calm but precise, as if she already knew the exact moment I would be ready. She gestured gently toward the exit leading to a private boarding corridor, and I followed without hesitation. The atmosphere shifted again as I moved, the soft lighting of the lounge giving way to a more structured passageway that felt reserved, not rushed. Behind me, through the glass partition, I could still see the terminal area where Jason remained. He was no longer pacing. He was simply standing there, watching, his phone lowered now as if even calling someone had stopped making sense. His expression was different than before. The confidence that once filled his posture had been replaced with something unsettled, like he was trying to rebuild a version of reality that no longer aligned with what he was seeing. The officer from earlier appeared again at the end of the corridor, waiting for me with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly, "we will escort you directly to your aircraft now." I gave a slight nod in response and continued forward. As we walked, I noticed the environment around this corridor was different from the standard boarding route. There were fewer passengers, fewer interruptions, and a level of coordination that suggested everything had already been arranged in advance. The officer walked slightly ahead of me, not rushing, but guiding with certainty. "There has been a full confirmation on your clearance level," he said after a moment, his tone professional but noticeably more formal than before. I glanced at him briefly. "Clearance level," I repeated softly. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Your profile was flagged for priority access through executive authorization." The words were simple, but they carried weight in the way they were delivered. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I focused on the steady rhythm of my steps and the quiet hum of movement deeper within the airport infrastructure. Behind us, Jason was no longer visible through the corridor glass, but I could feel the distance between us in a way that did not require sight. We reached a secured junction where another staff member awaited, holding a small tablet. She looked at me, then confirmed something on her screen before stepping aside. "Everything is ready for direct boarding," she said politely. The officer turned slightly toward me. "This will take you directly to the aircraft entrance, bypassing standard passenger flow." I nodded again. There was no urgency in my response, only acceptance. As we moved forward, I thought briefly about Jason, still somewhere behind in the terminal space, still trying to interpret a situation that no longer operated within the assumptions he had arrived with. The corridor opened into a controlled boarding bridge, quieter than any I had used before. The aircraft was visible now through the wide window panels, its presence steady and unmoving, waiting. The officer slowed slightly, and then spoke again, this time with a more deliberate tone. "Mrs. Collins, there is one additional confirmation I must provide." I turned my attention to him. He paused briefly, as if ensuring the words were correct before continuing. "Your boarding priority was not assigned for travel convenience. It was reinstated based on historical clearance authority recognition." I remained still for a moment. The phrase did not surprise me, but it settled differently than anything else I had heard that day. I simply replied, "Understood." The officer nodded once, then stepped aside, allowing me to continue forward alone into the final boarding passage. As I walked, the sound of the airport behind me faded further, replaced by the quiet stability of the aircraft entrance ahead. I did not look back. There was no need to. Whatever Jason was still trying to piece together, it no longer required my presence to resolve. I continued forward until the aircraft door came fully into view, and I stepped into the next stage of my journey with steady certainty. I stepped into the aircraft boarding bridge, where the lighting shifted into a softer, more contained glow, and the hum of the airport outside began to disappear completely behind me. Each step forward felt slower now, not because of hesitation, but because the environment itself had changed into something quieter, more controlled, as if the world outside had been intentionally reduced in volume. Ahead, the aircraft door stood open with a calm precision, and a flight attendant waited just inside, her posture straight, her expression attentive in a way that immediately signaled recognition rather than routine service. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Collins," she said with a respectful nod, stepping slightly aside to guide me forward. I returned the nod and continued inside without pause. The cabin was quieter than expected, with only a few passengers already seated, most of them absorbed in their own space. There was no sense of confusion, no delay, no questions. Everything seemed already arranged before I arrived. I moved toward my assigned seat, which had been prepared in a forward section of the cabin with noticeably more space and privacy than standard seating. As I placed my bag overhead and settled in, I could feel the subtle shift of attention from nearby passengers, not intrusive, but observant, as if they were registering that something about this boarding sequence had not followed the usual pattern. I sat down slowly, letting my hands rest calmly in my lap, and for the first time since arriving at the airport, there was no immediate demand, no interruption, no external pressure. Only silence. A flight attendant approached briefly, offering a glass of water and confirming if I needed anything before departure. I declined gently. My attention drifted toward the window beside me, where the terminal building was still visible in the distance. Through the glass and layers of structure, I could no longer see Jason, but I knew he was still somewhere behind those walls, still standing in the space where everything had shifted without his understanding. The aircraft door remained open for a few final moments as boarding completed. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained steady, organized, and calm, like a system already operating beyond disruption. I thought back briefly to the moment in the boarding line, to Jason's voice, to the certainty he carried that had slowly dissolved without him realizing it. There was no satisfaction in the memory, only clarity. A quiet understanding that assumptions often collapse not through force, but through exposure to what they failed to recognize. The cabin door began to close, and the sound changed immediately, becoming more enclosed, more final. The flight attendant secured the final checks, moving down the aisle with practiced efficiency. I remained still, watching the movement without reaction. Somewhere beyond this sealed space, Jason's perspective would still be unfolding, still attempting to align what he had seen with what he believed to be true. But inside here, the outcome had already moved beyond interpretation. The aircraft prepared for departure, and the soft announcement confirmed what I already knew, that everything was proceeding as scheduled. I leaned back slightly in my seat, allowing the stillness to settle fully around me. As the final connection to the terminal outside slowly disappeared with the closing doors, I remained seated as the cabin door fully sealed, the final sound of the latch closing marking a quiet separation from everything outside that aircraft. The atmosphere inside shifted almost imperceptibly as the plane prepared for departure, flight attendants moving with calm efficiency through the aisle, checking seats and confirming readiness. The seatbelt sign illuminated softly above, and a structured announcement filled the cabin, reminding passengers of the upcoming departure from Dayton International Airport to Chicago. I listened without movement, my hands resting still, my attention no longer divided between noise and reaction, but centered in a silence that felt earned rather than imposed. Around me, passengers adjusted their seats, opened small windows, or settled into quiet routines, unaware of the layered events that had unfolded just minutes before at the gate. For them, this was simply a flight. For me, it felt like the end of something that had never needed to be spoken aloud. As the aircraft began to move slowly away from the gate, I looked out the window. The terminal lights receded gradually, becoming smaller, less defined, until the structure itself felt distant, almost detached from the moment I was now in. Somewhere beyond that structure, Jason remained. I did not need to see him to understand that he was still trying to place meaning onto something that no longer responded to his assumptions. The plane turned slightly, aligning toward the runway, and the motion created a gentle shift in the cabin that grounded everything into forward progression. I leaned back slightly, not out of exhaustion, but acceptance. A flight attendant approached briefly, offering a final confirmation that all passengers were secured and ready for takeoff. I nodded in acknowledgement. Her expression carried the same calm professionalism I had seen throughout the aircraft, but there was a subtle difference in how she looked at me, as if recognizing something she did not need to question. I turned my gaze forward again as the engines increased their steady rhythm, preparing for acceleration. In that moment, I thought not about the confrontation, not about Jason's words, but about how quickly perception can collapse when it is built on incomplete understanding. The runway lights stretched ahead in clean, structured lines, guiding the aircraft forward with precision. The moment of takeoff arrived without disruption. The plane accelerated smoothly, lifting away from the ground in a controlled ascent that felt almost weightless. As we rose, the city below began to separate into smaller patterns of light, each one representing movement, distance, and lives continuing independently of one another. I watched it all without attachment, without urgency, as if observing something I had already stepped beyond. The cabin remained quiet, the hum of flight stabilizing into a consistent rhythm. I closed my eyes briefly, not to rest, but to process the stillness that had replaced everything that came before. Jason's voice no longer echoed in my mind. The airport, the line, the checkpoint, all of it had already become part of a sequence that no longer required resolution. When I opened my eyes again, the world outside had shifted entirely into altitude and distance. A flight attendant passed once more, offering a polite smile before continuing on. I returned it with a small nod, then looked out the window again. The ground was now far below, indistinct, reduced to patterns that no longer carried personal weight. In that quiet elevation, I understood something simple and final. Not everything that appears as control is actually power, and not everything that looks like confidence survives contact with truth. I remained seated, calm, present, as the aircraft continued its steady climb toward Chicago, leaving behind everything that no longer needed to follow me forward.